Welcome back and thank you for joining me once again for another Bible study as we continue in the book of Romans. Now, in our last session, we would have looked at what advantage sin had when a person was under law rather than under grace. And this was from Romans chapter 7, verses 7 to 12. And what Paul concluded was that the law brought the awareness of sin, which seemingly led to the increased struggle within trying to resist temptations or desires of the flesh without the ability to do so. So today we continue from where we left off, from Romans chapter 7, verse 13 to 25, on the topic, the law cannot save from sin. So reading from verse 13 through to 16, it says, and I quote, "Has then what is good become death to me? Certainly not. But sin, that it might appear sin, was producing death in me through what is good, so that sin, through the commandment, might become exceedingly sinful. For we know that the law is spiritual, but I am carnal, sold under sin. For what I am doing I do not understand. For what I will to do, that I do not practice. But what I hate, that I do." And we remember Israel's history concerning being under covenant law. They were told in Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 6 to 9, and also chapter 11, verses 18 through 20. And it says, and I quote, "These commandments that I give you today are to be on your hearts. Impress them on your children. Talk about them when you sit at home and when you walk along the road, when you lie down and when you get up. Tie them as symbols on your hands and bind them on your foreheads. Write them on the door frames of your houses and on your gates." End quote. So the law was to be posted everywhere and spoken of constantly, not only as a reminder, but that it would become a natural part of life, fully impressed upon the mind and hopefully making its way into the heart where real change is possible. But instead it became burdensome, where the people found themselves measuring their every action against what was written. That constant reminder of the failings and shortcomings, a standard that seemed all the more impossible to attain. Now in Acts chapter 15, at the convening of the Jerusalem Council, when Peter got up to speak concerning whether the Gentile converts should obey the law, and he said, and I quote, "Why do you test God by putting a yoke on the neck of the disciples, which neither our fathers nor we were able to bear?" And this is Acts chapter 15, verse 10. Peter describes observing the written code as a yoke, a restriction. This was an acknowledgement of the inability on the part of man without the Spirit of God to perfectly follow the dictates of the law. And so this is how Paul describes that colossal struggle within when trying to live a life pleasing to God, yet constantly failing to do so. The natural man versus the spirit man, like a boxing match. The tug of war that takes place within to gain mastery over the human soul. Because the natural man wants to indulge in fleshly carnal desires, which is sin that leads to death, while the spirit man wants to do that which is pleasing to God, which then leads to everlasting life. And the way to combat these things, Paul says, is to conform no longer to the way of the world, the former way in which we lived, but be transformed by the renewing of your mind, that you may prove what is that good and acceptable and perfect will of God. Romans chapter 12 and verse 2. Now, this next segment is called the continued struggle. And so we continue from verses 17 through 20. And Paul says, and I quote, "But now it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me. For I know that in me, that is, in my flesh, nothing good dwells. For to will is present with me, but how to perform what is good I do not find. For the good that I will to do, I do not do. But the evil I will not to do, that I practice. Now, if I do what I will not to do, it is no longer I who do it, but sin that dwells in me." And these verses are a reiteration of what we just spoke of as Paul identifies the struggle that takes place in the mind as the sinful nature seeks to retain control over the individual. And though a person may be born again in the Spirit, the old nature is still present and is controlled by the flesh. So all the more, there must be greater reliance on God's Holy Spirit to enable you to be victorious. Now, the mind or the soul is that aspect of man where the senses are located. It gives the awareness of the world around and allows you to experience emotions of pleasure and pain, joy and sadness, love and hate. It is what makes us to be in the likeness of God, as in the part of man that will continue to exist even after the physical earthly body is dead. So in this battle of the will, Paul concludes that if the good he wants to do is not what he ends up doing, but the evil he wills not to do is what he practices, then it is the sinful nature exacting control over him by the flesh. Now, here in this other section, it is from verses 21 to 23, and Paul identifies these controlling factors and he calls them laws. And he says, and I quote, "I find then a law that evil is present with me, the one who wills to do good. For I delight in the law of God according to the inward man. But I see another law in my members warring against the law of my mind and bringing me into captivity to the law of sin, which is in my members." And that is Romans chapter 7, verse 21 to 23. Now here he cites that there are what he calls laws that are at work in him, both diametrically opposed to each other. Hence, the spirit man delights in the law of God. In other words, this is similar to the spirit-led man who walks according to the dictates of the spirit so as not to fulfill the lusts of the flesh. And then in the same verse 23, there is a law at work in his body, which he calls his members. And this law is what holds him captive to the law of sin to do those things he does not want to do. And though this may sound confusing with the mention of all these laws, what he is simply saying is that within every human is the desire to do good and a desire for evil. The desire for good is what ultimately leads a person to resist the lure of the carnal nature, while the desire for evil is that natural carnal desire that seeks to overwhelm and overpower so that we can never take that step towards God. But Paul concludes by saying how wretched a person he is who has to contend with such a dilemma. It is like being pulled in different directions. But he gives a sigh of relief to this conundrum because Jesus is the answer to it all, the one who is able to deliver from this death trap. So now with his mind renewed by the Spirit through Christ, you can now live victoriously. And even though the carnal nature may want to rise up at times, you can quash its advances by continuously feeding the spirit man. And so we will end here for this week. And so until next time, May God continue to richly bless you